My name is Clara Dawson, and I will never forget the night my brother shattered my ribs while my parents shattered the last piece of my soul. It was supposed to be another Dawson family dinner, the kind my father orchestrated like a business presentation. Polished silver crystal glasses, a table crowded with donors and family friends, the smell of roasted chicken and rosemary filling the air. I walked in carrying tension like armor because I knew these nights were never about food, they were about Ethan. My brother sat at the head of the table beside my father, broad shoulders stretched like he owned the air in the room, already drunk, already laughing too loudly. He bragged about his new job, a position my father had pulled strings to secure, and when his eyes locked on me, his grin curled cruel. "You jealous Clara. Still just a nurse while I move up in the world." His words stung, but I forced myself to breathe steady. Then I answered clear enough for the table to hear. "That job was not earned, Ethan. It was handed to you like everything else." The silence was instant, the kind that sucks the oxygen from a room. My father's jaw tightened, my mother's eyes narrowed, and Ethan rose from his chair with the scrape of wood against tile that sounded like a blade unsheathed. He came around the table, fists clenched, face twisted with rage. Before I could stand, before I could even raise a hand to protect myself, his fist slammed into my chest. The sound was not just a punch. It was a crack, sharp and final, a sound that seemed to echo against the marble walls. Pain exploded through me, hot and unbearable, and my body folded as though my spine had turned to glass. I gasped, but no air came, only shallow rasps that clawed at my throat. I collapsed to the floor, the cold tile biting into my cheek. My ribs screamed with every desperate attempt at breath. The entire table froze every eye on me, yet no hand moved to help. Ethan stood over me, his chest heaving, and in his eyes I saw no guilt, only calculation. He muttered, "She asked for it," and retreated to his seat as if he had merely swatted a fly. My father's voice cut the air low and ruthless. "Stop crying. Be tough like him." His words dug deeper than Ethan's fist. They carried decades of disdain, every dismissal, every cold shoulder wrapped into one order, suffer in silence. My mother leaned down her perfume of lavender, suffocating her voice a whisper sharp enough to slice skin. "Do not embarrass this family. Your brother has a future. Stay quiet. Stay quiet." I could barely breathe, tears stinging, but refusing to fall because even then I knew they would call them dramatics. I tried to push myself up, but agony screamed through my side, and I collapsed again. I lifted my eyes toward the people around me, guests shifting uncomfortably, donors glancing away, wine glasses raised in awkward distraction. A fork clinked, a laugh too loud filled the void, and the conversation resumed as if I were nothing but a spilled drink on the floor. Ethan raised his glass again, a toast to himself. My mother smiled tightly, nodding along. My father leaned back, proud. And me, their daughter, lay crumpled on the tile, broken, ignored, erased. That was the moment I realized family dinners were not about family at all. They were about worshiping one child and burying the other. Something inside me broke that night that was not just bone. It was trust, belonging, the illusion that family meant safety. And as I lay there, gasping, the voices around the table blurring into background noise, one thought carved itself into my mind. If I stayed quiet again, I would not survive. Not my ribs, not my heart, not my soul. When I was a little girl, I used to believe families were supposed to be soft places to land. But growing up in the Dawson household quickly taught me otherwise. From the time I was old enough to remember, there was a golden child and a shadow child, and I was never the golden one. Ethan was born 3 years before me, and from his very first steps he was treated like a promise fulfilled. My father, Richard Dawson, told anyone who would listen that Ethan was destined for greatness. He was big for his age, loud, confident, and people praised him for qualities that in me were considered flaws. If Ethan spoke out, he was bold. If I spoke out, I was disrespectful. If Ethan demanded attention, he was strong-willed. If I asked for help, I was needy. That pattern was set in stone before I turned 10. I remember when Ethan tried out for Little League Baseball and hit a single during practice. My father cheered like it was a grand slam in the World Series. That same year, I entered a school writing contest and won second place with a short story. When I showed the ribbon to my parents, my mother smiled distractedly and told me to put it in my drawer so it would not clutter the fridge. They never asked what the story was about. I was 12 when Ethan pushed me off a swing at the park. My arm bent at an angle that made strangers rush to help, but my father shook his head and said loudly, "That is how kids learn balance." He said it like it was wisdom, like it was a lesson. My mother nodded, adding, "Do not cry, Clara. You will embarrass us." Ethan laughed all the way home while I cradled my arm in silence. At 16, when I earned a scholarship for nursing school, my father dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "Women do not need degrees, Clara. What you need is stability, a good husband." Meanwhile, Ethan barely scraped through high school, but when he was accepted into a small state college for football, my father held a party with balloons and speeches. Guests toasted to his future. No one mentioned mine. These double standards were so constant that after a while they became invisible. At family dinners, Ethan's seat was always in the center, mine pushed to the side. When relatives visited, I was introduced as the helpful daughter, the one who stayed out of trouble. Ethan was the pride, the dream, the man of the house in training. Even his failures were rewritten as triumphs. When he dropped out of college after tearing a ligament, my father declared he had made the brave choice to pursue business instead. When I graduated with honors from nursing school, my parents did not attend the ceremony. My mother claimed she had a headache. My father said he was too busy with clients. But when Ethan landed a part-time job at a local gym, they showed up with cameras posting photos online as if he had conquered Wall Street. These moments piled up until the pattern was undeniable. I was present, but not seen useful, but not celebrated. Ethan, on the other hand, could do no wrong. He could come home drunk and belligerent, and my mother would tuck him into bed. If I came home late after a shift at the hospital, she scolded me for being irresponsible. He was the heir. I was the spare. It became clearer the older we grew. My father would look at Ethan and say, "This boy will carry our name into the future." When he looked at me, his words were always about keeping quiet, about learning not to make waves. My mother's favorite line whenever I cried or protested was always, "Do not ruin your brother's chances." That refrain became the background music of my life. Even when Ethan injured me, even when he mocked me, the family line was the same: protect him, silence her. By the time I reached 28, I had stopped expecting applause or support. I worked double shifts at the hospital, paid my own bills, and lived in a small apartment off Elm Street. My brother lived in our parents' house, unemployed for months. Yet every Sunday, my parents boasted about him at church. I sat in the pews listening to my mother beam. "Ethan is working on something big. He has vision." No one asked about me. No one ever did. Looking back, I realized the night he broke my ribs was not an accident or even a sudden outburst. It was the culmination of years of permission, years of indulgence, years of my parents teaching him he was untouchable and teaching me I was disposable. That dinner table was just the latest stage in a play that had been running my entire life. The night of the attack had been planned by my parents as a celebration, not for me, but for Ethan, as always. It was supposed to be a gathering in honor of his new position at a real estate firm, a job my father had arranged through one of his old contacts, the kind of favor pulled with a handshake and a promise not through Ethan's own effort. The dining room was dressed to impress: crystal glasses lined in perfect symmetry, candles flickering the long oak table polished to a sheen. My mother hovered like a hostess on a television show, orchestrating every detail so that guests would leave. Convinced the Dawson family was untouchable. I arrived with a chicken pot pie I had baked the night before after my hospital shift, a recipe passed down from my grandmother. I carried it with care, believing foolishly that maybe, just maybe, it would be appreciated. My mother took one glance at the dish, smiled tightly, and said, "Oh, Clara, how sweet," before sliding it aside onto a counter already crowded with catered food. "We already have more than enough, dear." The dismissal stung, but I forced myself to sit quietly. When I looked for a seat at the table, I noticed at once that Ethan's spot was dead center beside my father where the spotlight naturally fell. Around him were family friends, donors from the community, and board members from the nonprofit my mother adored bragging about. My name card, on the other hand, had been placed at the far end near the swinging door that led to the kitchen beside an empty chair and a folded napkin. Not even a full place setting. My mother called down the table brightly. "We saved you a spot near the hallway." Clara as if it were an honor. I sat where I was told, hands trembling slightly in my lap, the scent of rosemary heavy in the air, my heart already beating fast with the familiar sting of invisibility. Conversation flowed easily around Ethan. Toasts were made first by my father, who raised his glass and said in his commanding voice, "To Ethan for reminding us what true leadership looks like." The guests clapped, some nodded solemnly, and my mother dabbed at her eyes with a napkin as if overcome with pride. More toasts followed, praising Ethan's supposed vision, his charm, his bright future. I sat at the edge, half in shadow, watching the performance unfold as if I were not part of it. When there was a lull, I gathered my courage and tried to contribute. I started to share a memory about how Ethan and I once volunteered at a cleanup project by the river when we were teenagers, thinking maybe the story would remind people of his flaws, maybe humanize him in a way that would balance the room. But before I could finish, Ethan cut me off with a chuckle. "That was years ago," he said, dismissive. "Clara has always had a good heart, but she never liked the spotlight." The room laughed. It was one sentence, but it reduced me from a participant to a prop. Heat burned up my neck and my eyes stung. I pressed my fingers into my napkin, forcing my expression to stay neutral. I tried to swallow the humiliation, but it sat like a stone in my throat. Later, when dessert arrived, slices of perfect tiramisu were passed down the table plates, gleaming silver forks set neatly beside them. I glanced toward the kitchen and saw through the gap of the swinging door my pot pie still sitting on the counter, untouched, forgotten. My chest tightened, but I stayed silent. The humiliation was layered sharp in its quietness. The seat by the hallway, the ignored dish, the laughter at my expense, the deliberate erasure of my presence. Each moment was a cut, and together they bled me dry. When I tried again to speak, to question how transparent Ethan's nonprofit really was, to point out the importance of accountability, the air around me shifted. Forks paused, smiles tightened, and then Ethan's eyes hardened, his chair scraped back, and the storm inside him finally broke loose. The blow that followed was not only his fist, but the culmination of years of being told I did not belong. When Ethan's fist cracked into my ribs and the room turned back to laughter, as though nothing had happened, I knew I could not stay in that house a second longer. I staggered out of the dining room, clutching my side, the chatter of glasses and clinking silverware echoing behind me like cruel music. No one followed. No one called out. My mother smiled. At a donor, my father raised his glass again, and Ethan leaned back in his chair as if violence had been nothing but a hiccup in the evening's script. I pulled open the side door and stumbled toward my car, every breath a lance of pain, the night air cold and sharp against my wet cheeks. My legs shook as I lowered myself into the driver's seat, and for a moment I thought I might pass out. But instinct took over. I turned the key, gritted my teeth, and forced the car down the long driveway, my knuckles white against the steering wheel. The 20-minute drive to the hospital felt like hours. Every bump in the road sent fire through my chest, each breath cut short, each turn of the wheel accompanied by a prayer that I would not faint before arriving. When I finally pulled into the emergency entrance, I collapsed against the horn, the blare drawing the attention of 2 orderlies who rushed me inside. X-rays confirmed what my body already knew. 2 ribs broken, 1 clean fracture, the other hairline, the kind that would take weeks of careful healing. The doctor, a calm woman named Dr. Helen Morris, studied the images, her brows furrowed with quiet concern. "This is not from a fall," she said gently. "Someone hit you." I stared at the ceiling, unable to answer, my chest tight, not only with pain, but with shame. She pressed softly. "Clara, was this your brother?" My lips trembled. I whispered, "Yes." Her eyes did not widen in shock. Instead, she nodded as though she had heard this confession too many times before. She adjusted the chart and said firmly, "I am legally required to report this. You are not safe if this continues." The words landed like stones. For years, I had been taught silence, told that keeping family secrets was survival. But now, here in this sterile room, smelling of antiseptic and latex, I realized silence was killing me. I could not protect Ethan. I could not protect their reputation at the cost of my own life. My hands shook as I reached into my bag for my phone. I opened the voice memo app, thumb hovering over the red button. For a long second, I hesitated, the old fear coiling in my chest, the voices of my parents whispering, "Stay quiet." But then the memory of the table returned, my father's growl, my mother's hiss, Ethan's fist. I pressed record. My voice was raw, strained, but steady enough to speak. "They told me to stay quiet tonight," I said into the phone. "They told me my brother's future mattered more than my broken ribs. But I will not stay silent this time. If I die in silence, I disappear forever." I stopped the recording, saved it, labeled it simply Evidence 1. A small act maybe, but it was the first time in my life I had created proof that could not be twisted or erased. Doctor. Morris returned with a brace and medication, helping me sit up slowly. She placed a hand on my shoulder, steady and grounding. "You did the hard part. You told the truth." It felt foreign in my mouth, the truth spoken out loud, written in my medical chart, existing in a system my parents could not edit. For the first time, I saw a path forward. Painful, terrifying, but real. I would no longer just endure. I would fight back piece by piece, starting with that memo, starting with these x-rays, starting with the courage to let my suffering be known. As I left the hospital with my ribs bound tight and the bottle of painkillers heavy in my pocket, the night sky stretched above me, dark and endless. But somewhere inside, I felt the first spark of something I had not felt in years: defiance. On the drive back from the hospital, the painkillers dulling only the sharpest edges of agony memories I had buried for years clawed their way back. It was as if my fractured ribs had cracked open a vault I had kept sealed. I remembered being 8 years old, standing in the kitchen with a handmade card I had worked on all week, glitter glue smudged on my fingers, proud of my drawing of our family. My father had come home in a storm of phone calls and briefcase slams. I held the card up to him, beaming, but he barely glanced at it before muttering, "Not now." Clara Daddy is busy, and moved on to ask Ethan about his little league practice. I remembered my 16th birthday. I had invited a few friends from school, hoping for once to feel celebrated. Ethan showed up late, barged into the living room with his football buddies, and within minutes, the music and the attention had shifted entirely to him. When the cake came out, he blew out my candles before I could, laughing as if it were a harmless prank. My parents laughed too, clapping like he was the life of the party. I sat there, smile frozen, as my own friends glanced at me awkwardly. That night, while scraping frosting off plates, my mother told me lightly, "Do not make a scene, Clara. He is just being playful." I remembered my graduation day from nursing school, one of the proudest moments of my life. I had worked nights, taken extra shifts, studied until my eyes blurred, and when I finally walked across that stage in my cap and gown, my parents were not in the crowd. I searched the faces hoping, but only emptiness met me. Later, I learned they had gone to attend a luncheon for Ethan's gym, opening a business he abandoned 6 months later. When I asked them why my father said Ethan needed our support more, "You are strong enough on your own." My mother nodded and added, "You will understand when you are older." These memories rolled one after another, a film reel of erasure and dismissal, each scene reinforcing the same lesson. Ethan was to be protected at all costs. I was to be managed, silenced, minimized. Even when Ethan hit me when we were teenagers, shoving me during an argument so I fell hard against the porch steps, my father had barked, "That is how siblings toughen each other." Even when I had a boyfriend in college, Mark, who treated me kindly and talked about a future, my father dismissed him with a sneer. "He is weak. You need a man like your brother, strong, relentless." That night, I broke up with Mark, ashamed, without knowing why. I see now that it was another stolen piece of my life, another way they conditioned me to bend around Ethan's existence. All of these moments had been fragments, things I told myself to forget because remembering hurt too much. But now, with my ribs wrapped tight and my body aching, I saw the line connecting them all. This was not a single night of violence. It was a cycle, a system. My parents had built a world where Ethan's failures were triumphs, where his cruelty was excused as strength, and where my pain was nothing more than background noise. I had learned to disappear politely to swallow hurt so the family image could shine. But I also knew that night in the hospital marked the end of that cycle. For the first time in years, I let myself ask a dangerous question. What if it was not my job to hold the family together? What if it was my job to tear down the lies? That question lit something inside me that painkillers could not dull, something more potent than fear. The report filed by Dr. Morris triggered a chain of events that my parents could not ignore, though they tried with every weapon they had. Within 48 hours, 2 officers were standing on the front porch of the Dawson home, knocking firmly, asking questions about the incident at the dinner. I did not see it in person, but a neighbor texted me a photo of the patrol car in the driveway. The caption was simple, "Are you okay?" I stared at it, my heart pounding, knowing the storm I had unleashed. My phone began buzzing not long after first, a call from my mother. I did not answer, so she left a voicemail, her voice clipped and rehearsed. "Clara, you need to stop this nonsense immediately. You bruise easily, everyone knows that, and you have always exaggerated things. Do not destroy your brother's future over a misunderstanding." Minutes later, my father sent a text. "Stop this before you regret it. Family matters. Stay in the family." The words chilled me more than the pain in my ribs. They were not even pretending to care about what had happened to me. They were only scrambling to contain the damage. Later that evening, Ethan himself called. His tone was strangely casual. "You made a mistake, Clara. You know you slipped, but you just want attention. Retract it and we can forget this ever happened." When I did not respond, he added sharply, "If you keep this up, you will ruin everything." He hung up before I could speak. The pressure was relentless. Messages poured in from relatives, cousins I had not spoken to in years, each one echoing the same narrative. "You are making a scene. Families fight. Stop seeking attention." The narrative was coordinated, orchestrated like a campaign. At work, I noticed whispers in the break room, colleagues glancing my way with pity or skepticism, and I knew my parents had started spreading their side of the story through the community. They had always been masters of image management. To them, reputation was more valuable than truth. I sat on my couch one night, scrolling through the flood of messages, my chest aching both from injury and betrayal, and I realized they were not trying to convince me of anything. They were trying to rewrite the story for everyone else before I had a chance to tell it. Gaslighting was their weapon, the same tool they had used all my life, but now it was public, loud, strategic. Still, there were cracks in their performance. One relative wrote privately, "I believe you, Clara. I have seen the way they treat you." That tiny message felt like oxygen in a suffocating room. Another coworker slipped me a note after a shift telling me she had overheard my mother at church insisting I had made the whole thing up. The note ended with 3 words, "Do not stop." Those small flickers of support reminded me that their campaign was not airtight. Yet the attacks hurt. Each voicemail from my mother dripping with condescension. Each warning from my father delivered like a threat cloaked as advice. Each denial from Ethan twisting what happened until I almost doubted myself. Almost. But then the bruises on my torso reminded me. The X-rays in my bag reminded me. The voice memo labeled Evidence 1 reminded me. I sat at my desk one night clutching my phone, listening again to my mother's hiss at the dinner table. "Stay quiet, she has a future." That was the line they could not erase, the whisper that had echoed in my ears every day since. If they thought gaslighting would silence me again, they had miscalculated. I was no longer the child willing to disappear politely. I was a woman with broken ribs and the truth in my hands, and I would not give it back. The pressure from my family's gaslighting campaign might have been enough to break me once, but not anymore. For the first time, I had proof, and I was determined to build a wall of evidence so solid they could not tear it down with whispers or lies. I began by organizing everything I already had. The X-rays and medical reports from Dr. Morris, carefully scanned and saved in multiple folders, each one backed up on a cloud account my parents did not know existed. I re-listened to my voice memo, the raw recording of myself whispering through pain, and copied it to 3 different devices. I labeled it not just as Evidence 1, but with the date and time so it would be indisputable. Then I started digging into my old journal's years of entries where I had scribbled down moments that hurt too much to say out loud at the time. I found the page from my 16th birthday when Ethan blew out my candles. I found the entry about graduation day when my parents skipped my ceremony to attend Ethan's failed gym launch. I photographed every page and saved them too. This was not just memory anymore. This was documentation. I knew that in a courtroom, truth alone was fragile, but truth written down, stamped with dates, and supported with records had weight. But evidence alone would not shift the narrative. I needed eyes on it. I needed people beyond my family's circle to see. That is when I remembered a neighbor, Mrs. Patel, who lived 2 houses down. She had one of those security systems with a doorbell camera, and she had been outside that night. Swallowing nerves, I knocked on her door. She looked at me with concern, her eyes flicking to the brace around my torso. "Clara, are you all right?" I asked if she had seen anything the night of the dinner. To my shock, she nodded slowly. "I saw you leave," she said. "You looked hurt. I also saw Ethan follow you halfway before turning back inside." She hesitated, then added, "My camera might have caught it." Within hours, she emailed me a clip, grainy but clear enough to show me stumbling out the side door, clutching my ribs, and Ethan looming in the doorway for a moment before retreating. It was not the punch itself, but it was damning context. I cried when I saw it, not out of sadness, but because finally, I was not invisible. Armed with all of this, I took the next step. I opened my old blog one I had abandoned years ago after graduate school. I changed the password, stripped the design down to something plain, and typed in bold letters at the top, my story. I began writing not with flourish or dramatics, but with facts. The date of the dinner, the sequence of events, the silence, the hospital visit, the quotes that still burned in my ears. I attached photographs of the X-rays, redacted but verifiable. I included a still shot from Mrs. Patel's video. I ended the post with a single line: "Silence protects power, not people." By the time I clicked publish, my hands were trembling, but not from fear, from adrenaline. Within hours, views trickled in. By morning, the post had spread through my small community, then beyond. Some readers left comments of support, others accused me of exaggerating, but what mattered was that the story was no longer theirs to control. My family panicked. Ethan posted a video on his social media sitting in his room with crocodile tears, insisting that he had been misunderstood, that he barely touched me, that I had slipped and twisted the truth to make him look bad. For a day, the narrative tilted his way. People called me bitter, jealous, dramatic. It almost worked until Mrs. Patel anonymously released the full video to a local journalist. The footage showed not only me stumbling out of the house, but the clear sequence of events leading up to it: the dinner toasts, Ethan's sudden rage, and his aggressive approach toward me before the camera angle lost him at the doorway. That was enough. The journalist published it with a headline that read, "Influencer brother, nurse, sister, and a family dinner gone violent." The story spread like fire. Comments flooded my inbox. Strangers told me they believed me. Advocacy groups reached out offering support. It was not universal. There were still those who called me a liar, but the tide was turning. For the first time, the Dawson narrative cracked. I had not only survived their gaslighting, I had flipped it, and deep inside I knew this was only the beginning. The courthouse loomed gray and heavy against the morning sky, its stone steps slick from last night's rain. I walked slowly beside my attorney, Denise Harper, a woman whose steady presence had become my anchor. She was sharp, experienced, and unshakable, with a reputation for cutting through lies like a scalpel through cloth. She had prepared me for this moment, meticulously reminding me that the defense would try to paint me as unstable, emotional, jealous, anything but credible. I wore a simple navy dress, my ribs still aching beneath the brace, a thin scar peeking from under the fabric where the injury had discolored my skin. Inside the courtroom, the air smelled of paper polish and the bitter tang of burnt coffee. Reporters sat in the back notebooks, ready their pens like daggers. When Ethan entered, flanked by my parents, the show began. He wore a pressed suit, his hair neatly combed, his expression carefully. Rehearsed contrition painted over arrogance. My mother dabbed at her eyes as though she were the victim, my father stoic, as if this was an unfortunate business matter. Their attorney stood tall, polished in a dark suit, already prepared to deliver their script. The judge, an older woman with silver hair, pulled back tight, presided with a gaze that saw through pretense. When the proceedings began, Denise rose first, her voice calm, authoritative. She presented the timeline, the medical evidence, the photographs of my bruised torso, the x-rays showing fractures. She introduced the voice memo I had recorded the night of the assault, my raw whisper about being told to stay silent. The courtroom listened in silence, the sound of my pain echoing through the speakers. Then came Mrs. Patel's footage. The grainy clip projected on the screen showed me stumbling from the house, clutching my ribs, Ethan looming briefly in the doorway. It was not the entire assault, but it was enough to shatter the claim that nothing had happened. Denise layered the evidence with precision, stacking fact upon fact until the weight became undeniable. The defense tried to twist the narrative. Ethan's lawyer argued that siblings fight, that accidents happen, that I had exaggerated. He suggested I sought attention, that I was jealous of Ethan's success. My father nodded gravely in agreement, as though the truth were obvious. My mother even took the stand, her voice trembling, insisting that I had always been dramatic, that I bruised easily, that I must have slipped. Denise cross-examined her with surgical control. "Mrs. Dawson, did you or did you not whisper to your daughter to stay quiet that evening?" My mother froze, eyes darting. She denied it, but the jury shifted uncomfortably, and Denise immediately played the recording where my mother's words were audible, hissed into my ear. "Stay quiet! She has a future!" The sound cut the air like a blade. Gasps rippled through the room. My mother's face collapsed in panic, her mask slipping for the first time. Ethan himself was called to the stand. He fidgeted, his confident exterior cracking under pressure. He admitted he had been drinking. He admitted he had stood over me when I fell. But he clung to the line that he barely touched me, that I had slipped. Denise leaned forward, voice firm. "Then how do you explain the fractures, the medical records, the witness testimony, and the video?" Ethan stammered, sweat gathering on his forehead. For once, he had no polished line. Then it was my turn. I walked to the stand slowly, each step heavy with the weight of years. I swore in, sat down, and looked directly at the judge. My voice did not shake. I described the dinner, the laughter, the humiliation, the blow that shattered my ribs. I recounted my father's command to stop crying, to be tough like him. I repeated my mother's whisper, sharp as a knife, telling me not to embarrass the family, that Ethan had a future. I told the court how no one helped, how the room had returned to celebration while I lay broken on the tile. I spoke of the hospital, the doctor, the evidence. I did not embellish. I did not cry. I let the truth stand on its own legs. The room was silent, the kind of silence that vibrates in the bones. Even Ethan looked down, his bravado crumbling. When I finished, I said simply, "I did not come here to destroy my family. I came here because they destroyed me, and I refuse to stay buried." Denise placed a supportive hand on my shoulder as I stepped down, and in that moment I felt taller than I had ever felt in their house. The judge listened to closing arguments with a stern expression. Denise's words were concise, factual, and relentless. She asked the court to see not just an incident, but a pattern, a cycle of abuse that had culminated in violence. The defense sputtered with claims of jealousy, of exaggeration, of family loyalty. But the tide had already turned. The verdict came swiftly. Ethan was found guilty of assault and ordered to pay damages for physical and emotional harm. A restraining order was granted immediately. My parents were placed under investigation for obstruction and perjury. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, reporters scribbling furiously. For me, the verdict was more than legal. It was a declaration that I existed, that my suffering mattered, that silence had finally been broken. The verdict did not just reverberate inside the courtroom, it exploded into the world outside. Within hours of the ruling, local news outlets carried headlines that read, "Nurse wins case against influencer brother and golden family image shattered in court." Social media split in two. Some voices still clung to the narrative my parents had built, claiming I was dramatic, bitter, even ungrateful. But far more people were outraged on my behalf, sharing the video of Ethan standing over me, quoting my mother's whisper, dissecting my father's command to be tough like him. Hashtags appeared overnight, some demanding accountability for Ethan, others calling out parents who sacrifice one child for another. Advocacy groups reposted my story as a symbol of resilience. I had gone from a shadow at the dinner table to a headline my name trending alongside words like courage and survival. For Ethan, the consequences were immediate and brutal. The real estate firm rescinded his contract within 24 hours, issuing a public statement that violence had no place in their organization. Former friends unfollowed him, online sponsorships pulled out, and his once polished influencer brand collapsed under the weight of public disgust. The comments on his last post turned into a flood of anger and mockery, people calling him coward, abuser, liar. My mother's carefully cultivated community presence also disintegrated. The nonprofit she volunteered with announced her suspension, citing concerns about integrity and credibility after the recordings of her words circulated. Her face, once smiling in glossy newsletters, vanished overnight. My father, the stoic businessman who had built his reputation on respectability, saw contracts canceled, clients withdrawing, partners distancing themselves. Rumors spread of financial strain lawsuits and finally whispers of bankruptcy. The Dawson empire, once a fortress of image, cracked and crumbled in public view. And in the middle of it all, I stood, not gloating, not celebrating, but simply breathing in relief that truth had finally outweighed silence. When the damages were awarded, I declined to accept them for myself. Instead, I instructed Denise to direct the funds to the Dallas Women's Shelter, a place dedicated to protecting women trapped in cycles like the one I had endured. Reporters asked why. I told them plainly, because this was never about money. It was about breaking a silence that has cost too many women their lives. The shelter director cried when she received the donation. That moment meant more to me than any courtroom victory. But the fallout was not only external. Inside my family's circle, the fractures widened beyond repair. A cousin messaged me quietly saying, "You were brave. I wish I had spoken years ago." An aunt called to apologize for never defending me. At the same time, others cut me off entirely, accusing me of betrayal, saying I had destroyed the family. I realized then that truth does not unite everyone. Sometimes it burns bridges that were never safe to cross in the first place. For me, the greatest consequence was freedom. I no longer jumped when my phone buzzed with their names. I no longer bent myself small to fit their narrative. The world knew what had happened, and there was no going back. I walked through the grocery store one afternoon, and a stranger stopped me, placing a gentle hand on my arm. "You are Clara Wright. I saw your story. You are why I called the police on my neighbor last week. He had been hitting his wife for years. You gave me courage." My throat tightened, my chest ached, but not from broken ribs. From something heavier and lighter all at once. Impact. That was the real consequence, the ripple beyond me, beyond Ethan, beyond the Dawsons. The truth had broken chains in places I would never see. My family had wanted to bury me in silence, but instead, my voice had become a crack in the wall for others to step through. And that, more than any verdict, was justice. 6 months passed after the trial, and life no longer moved with the constant weight of dread pressing down on my chest. Healing was not linear, but I found myself breathing more deeply, sleeping longer and waking without the echo of my father's growl or my mother's hiss in my ears. The scar beneath my ribs remained a thin reminder of pain, but it no longer owned me. I began to pour my energy into something new, something that would outlast even the shadow of my family's downfall. When the Dawson home was foreclosed after my father's company declared bankruptcy, it appeared in the county auction listings, and Denise, ever the strategist, suggested I make a bid through a friend's LLC. At first, the idea terrified me. Why would I ever want to step back into the house where silence had been law and humiliation had been routine? But then I realized that reclaiming the space was not about nostalgia. It was about rewriting the narrative. The bid was accepted quietly, and one morning I drove up the long driveway as the rightful owner keys cold in my hand. The house looked the same on the outside, red brick and white shutters, but to me it felt hollow, stripped of the false grandeur my parents had once projected. I did not move in. Instead, I gutted it. The dining room where my ribs cracked against tile was transformed into a circle of mismatched chairs and sturdy tables where women could share stories and be believed. The upstairs bedrooms became counseling spaces, the kitchen redesigned into a communal area for cooking classes and support groups. In the front yard, I planted a small sign that read, "The Haven No Names, No Legacies, Just a Promise of Safety." Women came slowly at first, tentative, uncertain, then more arrived, bringing children, bringing tears, bringing laughter that eventually filled the hallways. Sometimes I sat in the garden with them, feeling the sun warm my skin, listening to their stories spill like rivers that had been dammed too long. The quiet in that house no longer hurt, it healed. Meanwhile, Ethan disappeared from public view, his accounts deleted, his reputation in ashes. My mother retreated into bitter silence, her name forgotten in the circles she once craved. My father, stripped of contracts and allies, faded into obscurity. I did not chase them. I did not gloat. They had built their own downfall, and I had chosen another path. One evening, months later, I stood at a podium in Houston at the National Women's Leadership Summit, invited to speak on a panel about breaking silence. Looking out at the sea of faces, women young and old, I felt my throat tighten, not with fear, but with reverence. I told them about the night at the dinner table, the punch, the whisper, the silence that followed, and how I had chosen not to let it bury me. I told them healing is not about pretending it never happened, but about reclaiming your story so no one else can write it for you. When I finished, they rose to their feet, and in that roar of applause, I felt a piece of myself restored that I had thought gone forever. After the event, a woman in her 70s grasped my hand and whispered, "Thank you. Because of you, I told my daughter the truth about what her uncle did." That was the real reward. Not the headlines, not the verdicts, but the ripple of voices breaking free because mine had refused to stay quiet. Back at the Haven, a young woman once asked me why I did not put my name on the sign outside. I smiled and told her, "Because this place is not about me. It is about us." And as the evening sun dipped behind the roofline of the house that had once been my prison, I realized that sometimes the loudest thing you can do is speak the truth, even if your voice shakes, even if the world tells you to hush. My ribs healed crooked but strong. My spirit healed truer still. For the first time in my life, I was no longer Clara the Shadow. I was Clara, survivor, witness builder of refuge, and I was free.